Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Honkference. This is our first event proper, as it were. And I'm here with marketing and publicity representatives, Hanna, Lough, and Sarah Lough. No confusion there at all. So I'm not going to hang around and waste too much time on words. I'm going to hand pretty much straight over to them to tell you about their jobs, and then come back in later and we'll answer some of your questions. There's a question feature down the bottom of your screen. If you want to ask any questions, please place them in there. And if you go there and you find somebody's already asked the question you were wanting to ask, then just click on the side and vote for it. And if you don't want to ask a question, go in there and have a look and vote for the questions that you think, oh yes, I'd like to know that. And that way we know which ones to ask first. So with no more ado, I shall hand over to Hanna and Sarah.
Morning, everyone. It's been really nice getting a weather update for the entire country while we wait, so thank you. I am the Senior Publicity Manager at Scholastic, and I used to work with Sarah when we were both working at Faber, so we have quite a lot of crossover. I thought I will kick off first by talking about what I do as a publicist, and then I'll hand over to Sarah to talk about marketing, because I know that the title of this event is the same but different, and it is often very confusing for everyone what a publicist does and what a marketer does. I was explaining to published authors yesterday what the difference was, so it's not unusual to not know. So, as a publicity manager, I am an author's main point of contact for anything like events, which in children's is obviously very specialised, because you're not always just going to a talk where you sit and you get asked questions. You often have to have a prepared event that's interactive for children, that makes use of your book. You often have a bit of tech involved, or props and things like that. So your publicist is your go-to person on things like that. But as well as helping you construct an event, I'll also help you get events placed. So that will be with independent bookshops and in schools. It might be in festivals. If you have a launch party, it's likely that I would be organising that. And what I am also responsible for is helping people find your books in a sort of organic way. So I'm the person who chases press reviews. I'm the person who sets up a press interview and might talk over with you any angles you have that are particularly relevant to your book and your story, that can sort of turn into a bigger piece. So I speak to radio, I speak to broadcast, I speak to children's specific media. I'm often the person as well who's in charge of award submissions and making sure that your books get submitted for awards, organising shortlist copies. It is a very varied job all day. I'm always doing different things, obviously a little bit more samey same at the moment, because we're stuck inside and a huge part of my job is events. I also, and this is where a lot of it gets muddled, I work on social media as well, so I will be seeking out reviews and retweeting them, or retweeting things that my authors are saying, or letting people know that there's an event going. But I know that that also falls under what Sarah does, because social media tends to be a slightly shared beast. And I will probably remember 10 things I do after Sarah starts talking. So I'm going to hand over and possibly come back.
Sounds good. Yeah, do butt in, Hannah. Thank you for those who blessed me. I'll try not to sneeze again. But remember to turn off my mic, so that was good. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah. I am the Children's Marketing Manager at Faber. Faber's an independent publisher, publishes, authors from Kazuo Shiguru, Sally Rooney. The children's team within Faber is quite small, so there are only 6 of us who work exclusively on children's books. So that's 1 person in marketing and 1 person in publicity. Which is lovely, because it means you sort of have to do a bit of everything. And as Hannah mentioned, there's quite a lot of overlap with marketing and publicity. And I think that happens even more in a smaller team, because it's very much everyone mucking in. So yeah, that's where I work. I think marketing is really fun, obviously, especially in kids' books. We get to do lots of really great creative stuff, and work with some brilliant authors, and I really like to work quite collaboratively with authors as well. So that's something I always recommend, just keeping those lines of communication open. So generally, sort of the marketing differentiation from publicity is the paid for activity. So the sort of advertising things and producing extra materials for books. So sort of the initial process would be the trade marketing, which is when you're advertising the books to sort of the booksellers and the gatekeepers of the books who will, bring the books then further to readers. So we'll often do quite a lot of activity to try and engage them really early on, sort of like 6 months at least before the book is due to be published. We'll do things like produce proof copies, which are uncorrected editions of the books to send out to booksellers, and also press. So that's something that overlaps again. So I'll work with the publicist to put together proof packages or sampler packages or lots of different things depending on the book and what seems right for that campaign. But it means we get to be quite creative, and sometimes we send out little sweets, or sometimes we send fancy envelopes, or we stamp the envelopes, and we just try and be as creative as we can to try and make sure that your book stands out amongst all the other books that the booksellers and people are likely to receive. And then sort of a bit close to publication, we'll do POS, which is point of sale material. And this again, like, completely differentiates between different books, different age ranges, what sort of thing works best. So we can do stuff like a run of bookmarks, which can be useful for bookshops to have like at the till point, so they can hand out to people as they come. Or we can do like t-shirts for booksellers to wear, which is really fun, or just like other window display materials, which booksellers can use to create a lovely display in their bookshop so that your book would stand out amongst all the other amazing books. And also, if an author is doing a lot of events, we'll tend to do things like postcards or bookmarks so that they can then hand them out to children and stuff at the events. So again, that's a really fun aspect. Another thing I do is sort of, which again sort of overlaps with publicity, is coordinate partnerships. So working with other brands who like our audiences align specifically for a book, if we want to target a really specific audience, or we work with like educational partners like Book Trust, National Literacy Trust, Authorify, to try and reach like schools and libraries and like the Reading Agency. And that's a lovely way to sort of combine our sort of love of reading and this particular book or this particular campaign of books. And then another fun one I did, which actually I did with Hanna before she left, was we partnered with Mudshoot City Farm and went to the goat bit, and we took one of our authors who'd written a picture book called The Goat Cafe, and we got her to sit on a bale of hay and read her picture book to the goats and the goat babies. And we got someone to film that, and it was the best day I think I've ever had. The goats were mad and they were eating everything, which luckily is what they did in the book, so it was completely on brand. And it was lovely for us to sort of like share that day with Mudshoot and promote Mudshoot because they're like a charity, and also create some amazing content for our social media advertising, which links me quite nicely onto social media, which again, you know, the publicist and marketer do together. We do it a lot of sort of joint campaigns, especially the influencer stuff. So sending out to Instagrammers or big teacher influencers, that stuff we do together. But on the marketing side, it's mainly the paid advertising. So this is across sort of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, anything you can think of, which is sort of all the sponsored ads that we can target specific audiences, which is again super useful for reaching people who don't already organically follow us on social media. And then we also work with like teacher influencers to do campaigns. So we work with one who writes sort of teaching resources for us for some of our books, where it seems like the book would be like really well used in a classroom. So we pay them to write resources and then we share them on social media, and it's just another way to bring another dimension to the book. So yeah, I think that's pretty much most of my job.
I should say that the goat thing broke my heart because we set it up and then I left the publisher, so I never got to meet the kids, as it were. It was devastating. I'm just going to quickly follow up because you mentioned about independent publisher and bigger publishers. So Scholastic, I should have said, is one of the biggest children's book publishers in the world. It started in the US. It turned 100 last year, so it's 101st year this year, and is spread sort of around the world in a way that Faber isn't. We have a much big, because we only publish children's books, obviously our marketing and publicity team is a lot bigger. There are advantages and disadvantages, I think, to either option, but in terms of the dedication that you get from your publicity and marketing person is, I would say, the same. It's just sometimes the methods differ ever so slightly. Someone has said, these jobs sound amazing, where can I send my CV? I don't know if it's of interest for us to quickly rattle through how we ended up doing the jobs we're doing. I realise this is mostly for authors, but so I studied English very boringly, and I then did a master's in children's literature, and I then went for every assistant job I could see going. I did do some unpaid work experience, which is now much more frowned upon, which I think is a really good thing. And in fact, both publishers that we work at pay internships. But yes, you don't specifically need any particular degree to work in publishing. I would say my first job was a marketing assistant maternity cover for 6 months, and since then I've always worked in children's books. I find my master's useful, but it's not generally why I got my job. A lot of advice for people who are looking to get into, I mean, I feel like we're probably quite similar on this, Sarah, in terms of backgrounds, is making sure that you get yourself involved in the book world, which obviously all of you are because you're here this morning. But it'll be, go to book events, review online, talk to people about books, go to book clubs. For people who are trying to get into the industry, if you don't have the experience for it, obviously what you have to rely on is your knowledge and love of books, and that is what we're looking for. Have I missed anything else desperately important about getting into publishing, Sarah?
I don't think so. I had quite a similar routine, really, which was that I did my degree and then I did quite a few unpaid internships, and both at sort of literary festivals, which, post-pandemic, I really recommend. They were really fun, and they weren't paid, but they sort of provided accommodation and stuff, so it didn't cost any money to do them, as opposed to the London-based ones where obviously I'm not from London, so had to pay for where I was staying and stuff. So that was not ideal, but it's one of those annoying things where if you happen to be there doing the work experience and a job comes up, you're much more likely to be asked for interview. So that's basically what happened when I actually weirdly worked at Scholastic before I worked at Faber. So that's when I was doing work experience at Scholastic, and they were hiring for a sales assistant, and I was like, hello, please hire me. And luckily they did. And then internal vacancy came over at marketing, and I was like, this seems more my thing. It's more fun and silly, and I love fun and silly things. So got that job and then moved to Faber. So yeah, I think it's one of those things where before I entered the industry, I had no real knowledge of what sort of current publications were. Obviously, doing an English literature degree as well, you're very familiar with the classics and the canon and stuff. But yeah, just sort of having an awareness and going into bookshops and seeing what books they're promoting. And so then if you get an interview or a placement at that publisher, you can say, I've seen this book and this looks amazing, and I've seen what you've done, and sort of keeping an eye out on, especially if you're interested in marketing publicity, keeping an eye on what campaigns publishers are doing. So on their social media, they'll tweet or share sort of things that they're doing to promote books, and just having an awareness of what sort of stuff publishers are doing is a really good thing to do and fun.
I've just seen a question that yes, okay, so I won't answer the question that's in the chat. I've just seen the comment come up at the side, but we will come to that in terms of social media and what we expect or ask authors to do, which again, as the answer is going to be for a lot of these things, it's really varied. I would say also, if you wanted to work in publishing, having a social media presence is really useful so that we can see what you've engaged with. And I agree with Sarah in terms of being up to date. So when we have job applications coming through, if they can't mention a book that's on your list, it doesn't come across very well, because we want to know why you want to work at this publisher. I was very excited to go to both Faber and Scholastic because they have such wonderful backlists. Faber's got all of sort of the Sylvia Plath and people like that who also did children's books, but they were also doing some really exciting stuff in middle grade and YA when I started. And then the picture book list launched just after I started. And then at Scholastic, there's Hunger Games, there's Northern Lights, there's Immortal Engines. But they also have incredibly exciting up and coming people who are sort of changing the framework. And you need to show that you are aware of those and interested as well.
And also just to say on social media, in terms of actually, yeah, that's the question, isn't it? For writers, I'd say, we never force a writer to go on social media. We wouldn't not acquire them if they're not on social media, but I just recommend it as a lovely friend, especially the children's industry is such a lovely, friendly space. You don't have to necessarily worry about how many follows you have or how many likes your tweets get, but just sort of interacting with that community is just a really lovely thing. And especially obviously in these times when we can't go to book events and stuff, it's been, I know for some of our writers, especially the sort of debuts, it's been a really valuable experience just to be able to interact with other people going through similar situations. And I know one of our authors sort of met a group of people who were all being published that year, who were all debuts that year, and they became a little like book club, and that was really helpful for her to have people outside of her own publisher to talk to about what was going on. So I just sort of recommend it rather than you should have it.
Yes, I'd say it's a useful bonus. Okay, should I start with the questions then, which I can open?
Do you want me to do the questions? Shall I come back?
That might be a bit easier rather than me scrabbling for them. Yes, please.
Okay, so we've got lots. We've got 16 questions.
Great.
And the one with 16 votes, in fact, is pretty much you've just answered it. Is it important to have a social media presence as a hopeful future author? And
so I'll give my publicity answer. Is you can be entirely successful without a social media presence, and I think it is far better to not have one than have one that looks like your publicist has shoved you onto social media and you're doing it because you've been told to. Someone asked in the main chat about personal stuff, and actually that's a really good thing. No one likes to see someone just tweeting about their book, just retweeting praise, just letting people know that they can get it at all good bookshops. Obviously you should be doing that. It's it's part of your job. But people like to know that people are real. It's kind of what Sarah was saying about, the children's world is incredibly supportive and lovely. And it is nice to be a part of that. But one of the things that's so lovely about it is that people's pets get posted. You see people's snow days. You see other books that they're reading that they like. And I think that is more important than just saying that your book is available. I can't deny that it does help me having an author that has a social media presence, but it isn't the be all and end all.
I mean, our best-selling author was like, my dog pictures get at least twice as many likes as my book pictures. And she's a bestseller, so it happens. But in terms of the platforms themselves, actually, I'd say Twitter is the best one for sort of community, because you can have those conversations and interactions most easily, and you can talk to multiple people. So that's the sort of the main one, I'd say. And then people do use Instagram more for the YA community, I'd say. Hanna, do you agree?
Yeah, I would. And also, Instagram is such an aesthetic place. I love using Instagram to look, but I often don't feel equipped to compete with beautiful pictures of books and other paraphernalia. So I find Instagram a useful tool. It is very much used by the YA community. I'd say middle grade, you're looking more at the Twitter arena. And actually probably picture books still there, but they've still got quite a hook on Facebook, I think.
Yeah, and that's also, sorry, Hanna. That's also sort of interacting with teachers and librarians and booksellers and all those people that are all on Twitter, tend to be more on Twitter than on Instagram from what I've seen. But again, it's sort of like you'll be best at the platform that feels the most right for you. So if you're sort of the sort of person who loves Instagram, go for it on your Instagram and start trying to sort of interact with other bookie people on Instagram if that's where you feel like most at home. Whereas if you're the sort of person who likes to send out lots of tweets and have lots of chats with people on Twitter, then that's probably more right for you as well.
Mm-hmm. It's also, I think, worth noting with Twitter. No, I've completely lost my train of thought. I know that's what I was starting with. I think it was a response to someone else. Yes, it's also, that's it, I've got it. Don't let me forget again. Sorry. It's also worth noting that a lot of the time you aren't, when you're using social media, unless you're YA, you're probably not talking to your audience on social media. It's a very different kind of conversation for children's publishing, because actually you're trying to speak to parents and what we call gatekeepers, which is teachers and librarians and people that we're trying to convince to bring the books to school. So there is a little element of separation. So I wouldn't worry too much about you not sort of speaking directly to your readers, because you can't on social media, because it would be illegal for them to be using it. So it's a little bit of a,
Yeah, so just sort of in response to someone in the chat, I wouldn't worry necessarily about splitting your personality between a sort of author in sort of an author social media and a you social media, because you are interesting as a person, as a full-rounded person, as an author, and as anything else you do. So we would probably rather have your social media just be about you, and your sort of writing comes within that, which would sort of make your social media more interesting to anybody anyway.
I would absolutely agree. If you can look at my Twitter as a publicist, I'm AITCH Lough on Twitter. There's lots of me tweeting stuff about books. There's also a lot of my cat. There's the fact that of other extracurricular things that I do and involved with, so like a committee for publicists, and I'm part of a children's radio show, and that I don't keep those separate. All of it is together.
So one of the questions that's right up at the top there is, what tips can you share for authors to raise their own profiles? And basically, I think you've just answered that you're saying to not just focus on the books, to show a bit of the person behind the books, because that's what people are looking for. And remember that you're talking to influencers and gatekeepers and parents and teachers and librarians, not at your actual necessarily your readership.
And I always think it's important to sort of share your process organically. Don't try and only focus on the milestones. If you're having like a bit of a bad writing day, sharing that is interesting as well, and sort of just sharing the process as you're going through it.
Yeah, and just get involved in conversations. Everyone's very friendly. People will know you more the more your name crops up.
Brilliant. So the one that's at the top of the list at the moment is, how do you allocate budgets for individual book promotions, and do they vary?
That's such a big question. Do you want to go first, Sarah?
I think it's obviously different in different publishers, but generally it's led by our sales team in terms of what, when we acquire a book, the sales team will sort of project the sales based on how relevant they think the book is to the market and how many copies it will sell roughly. And then that will sort of inform their sales targets sort of later down the line. So when it is coming up to publication, they'll say, we need to get it in these retail slots, we want to get it into these bookshops, this book is right for this. And then based on their projection, we will then base our budget on that, because obviously we don't want to put all of our marketing budget on a book which is not projected to sell as many as one of the lead books. But it's difficult to simplify it that much. It is it's quite complex, and it depends on a lot of factors. And there are some books where there's such a specific audience that we know we can reach really easily. We don't need to spend a lot of money to reach that audience. So even if that book is projected to sell more, that won't necessarily get more budget. Sorry, it's not very easy to answer.
Yeah, and budgets can shift as well. If someone suddenly wins an award, then more marketing would be shifted in to make the most of that. It's probably another difference between our jobs, actually, is that most of my job is less budget oriented, because in theory you're going to events, and I don't pay for my authors to do events, and you should never pay to do an event. I feel like that's a really, really important thing to say, actually. So my budget is more about travel or things that are going out with a book, like Sarah was talking about proof copies. So it's very difficult, I think, to get an overall picture of the expectations for your book by thinking about the budget, because of what Sarah said. It's specific, or we're like, oh, this is definitely a Sainsbury's book, so we will react differently, whereas this we think will primarily sell in Waterstones or Indies and things like that. Sometimes if a book has a really good PR hook, it will be more publicity led, because we're more confident in placing publicity. Because for me, my job is less of a sure thing in terms of what gets done than Sarah's. So if Sarah picks to advertise something, it gets advertised. If I pitch to a radio station, they might completely ignore me. So it depends on what angles we have to work with, and that will. So it's often moving even during.
Yeah,
I would say.
So in terms of reacting to engagement. So if a book I start to run an advert for gets a lot of traction and a lot of people seem to be interacting with it, I will then put more budget on it because it's working. So we wouldn't continuously throw money at a book where it's not working. We'd probably try and shift the campaign to another level, because there are lots of things we can do without spending a huge amount of budget. Like I mentioned, with partnerships and working with other brands, that's often not paid for activity, but can reach a huge audience and can be a really lovely thing to do in the campaign, and much more creative than doing, £500 of Facebook adverts. So
I would also like to add, because I feel this ties in slightly with budget, and I've seen it worry authors before. If you end up speaking to your publicist and marketer and they are the assistant, it does not mean that your book is not important. And I know sometimes authors worry if they have sort of the most junior person in the team. I wouldn't. The most junior person in the team is someone who is new to the job, is incredibly excited about what they're doing, is very passionate, has sometimes more freedom to try things out and see what happens. I was a very, very dedicated assistant, and every book I worked on sort of had my soul in a way that I have to now. I'm also managing people now, and I have overall strategy to think about. So my point is don't worry about who's working on your book and think about that in terms of budgets. You get a very different experience depending on someone's seniority, and the junior people in publishing are incredibly passionate and full of energy. And I think
really not worrying too much about budget and just sort of working collaboratively with your marketer and publicist, regardless of what your budget is, will make your campaign better, because there's so much you can do without a huge budget, and it's like that would be more fun for you to be involved with rather than worrying about that stuff. Hope that helps.
That's really cool. We've got a lot of questions from
we should give
independent writers, sort of asking what their best approach. I'm sort of clumping them together a little bit, but asking what their best approach is for publicising their own work, given that they don't have a publisher behind them if they've self-published.
That is tricky and a little bit out of my wheelhouse, if I'm honest. I don't really know. I would say try and make friends with your local bookshop and see if they'd be prepared to stock it and whether you can do an event with them. Social media becomes much more important, I will say.
Yeah, it'll be about having a network, won't it?
In terms of sales and so on, I really can't comment. I'm gonna try and suggest a marketing thing, but I'll hand over to Sarah.
I mean, again, it's not my area, but I think there are lots of authors that do it very successfully, especially those that have like a very particular niche. And if they build their own audience and that's their niche, and that, you know, if they write specific fantasy and they have that audience, then it doesn't matter that they don't have a publisher. So sort of finding your audience online and interacting with them and engaging with them as much as possible, and building those relationships, and also building relationships with other authors, even if they're not also independently published, if they're just authors published by other publishers, just building that your network, because say you make friends with another author and they're going to do an event, and the event person says, do you know someone else that would be good, then they could suggest you. So even though you don't have a publicist, you can still get on panels and stuff. So I think just sort of making friends.
Someone actually has put an answer that we didn't think of, which is an excellent one, which is blog tours. If you can connect with bloggers yourself and offer to write things for them. There is a lot of, it particularly applies to publishing in terms of writing for free and content and valuing your work, which I very much appreciate, but it is very useful to be able to give a little bit of time for free projects for promotion. We tend to ask people to be sort of available around publication, and then if extra things are asked for after that, it can be, that's when you need to start pulling back, I think, on doing things for free. But blog tours are actually very useful things to do in terms of getting people to see your book.
Going on from that, is it worth, one of the questions is it recommended to have a blog as an author? Is an author blog worth having? Is it just a time consuming rabbit hole to go down, that a good procrastination from actually doing writing?
It can be the latter. I don't know about Sarah, but I'd say it's probably pretty similar to our questions about other social media. It's good if it's useful for you. If you enjoy doing it, you can tell when someone has not enjoyed writing a blog post, I generally find. It's sometimes useful to have a sort of a landing page for teachers and librarians who are looking for you and want to get in touch. Particularly if they're not using social media, having a sort of web page can be useful. But again, it's not the end of the world, I would say.
Okay, and two very specific questions. Any particular hashtags that are worth following, and who are the top 3 influencers, and do they are they interested in independent writers, in self-published writers, and how do you sort of like make an impression on them?
Oh, that's such a big question.
Yes.
Do you want to go first, Sarah? I feel like I keep jumping in, and I feel bad.
Do I want to go first? No. I think I wouldn't like to necessarily name names of who the top 3 influencers are. I think that would probably, but I think they're interested in all books, and it's about relationships. So if you like, they wouldn't necessarily read a book by some random publisher if they've never heard of if they've never spoken to anyone in that publisher, whereas I feel like I've built up relationships with lots of influencers over the years I've worked in marketing, and therefore I know what they're likely to like, and therefore I would suggest to send them or to give them a book that I know that they would engage with, rather than just blanket sending people stuff. So as an independent writer, it's a similar process, because if you sort of have interacted with them or followed them on Twitter and seen what sort of stuff they share, if it looks like sort of the similar genre to your book, then I would suggest reaching out and saying, I've seen that you're a fan of this book. I also love that book. Would you be interested in reading my book or a sample from my book, because I think you'd also enjoy it. So that's sort of building relationships.
Relationships are hugely important. It affects me in my job as well. Like, I know that there are certain journalists that particularly like fantasy, or particularly like really lovely contemporary stuff, or have a softness for picture books, and I will send them extra emails about that. So it's the same sort of thing. I think it is impossible to name top 3 influencers for children's books, because you will have people who are phenomenal for YA or excellent for middle grade, and it's not really comparable. And you'll also get influencers who are technically nothing to do with books, but also when they post a book post, sorry.
If you're sort of starting out on social media, like, follow the children's publishers, follow like Book Trust, follow Authorfight, follow all the sort of organizations, and that will sort of lead you into the community, and follow authors that you love, and it's very easy to find everyone once you're sort of in there. I wouldn't say there are any hashtags, Hannah, would you?
No, there's a couple of sort of there's like MG chat and YA chat and things like that are sort of regularly run conversations. I don't tend to use them, but admittedly that's because I'm already in the industry. I can't think of any other than that.
They're quite a good way of getting in and finding names, though, and sort of as a start to find threads to unravel, I think. But yeah, it's hard work, isn't it? Basically, it's a question of, alongside your writing, putting in the time to get to know the market through things like Twitter specifically, and then building relationships. So yeah, hard work.
But building relationships is much more important than worrying about how many followers you have or how many likes your tweets get. That's the sort of main point I'd like people to take away, is just don't worry about how big your presence is. If you're submitting to publishers, they're never going to, we don't talk about how many followers people have. We just, like to know them as a person and know what relationships and networks they have is just more useful for them and useful for a publisher as well.
I would like to say actually that there are some independent authors in the chat who are making lovely recommendations, because it is their area of expertise. So do have a look at what everyone's saying.
And I'd like to say, to add to that the chat will still be there if you come back later. All people in the audience, you don't have to watch the recording again, but the chat you can scroll through at any time for any of the information that's put in there.
Great.
Okay, so we've got some more technical questions, like how do you measure the success of a campaign? Obviously, volume of sales is a kind of key thing, but how do you have ways of measuring specific bits of your marketing campaign and how successful they've been? Is that possible?
Yeah, shall I jump in, Hannah?
Yeah.
I feel like it's probably slightly easier to measure marketing. In that, I mean, it is sales led and it's also engagement led. Those are the sort of the two streams. So sales is obviously quite straightforward. If we run an advert, we can see how many sales, like on social media, we can see how many sales were as a result of that. But obviously, we don't know that someone might have seen that advert and later gone to a bookshop and picked up that book. So it's not as clear cut as we spent X and we made X. It's much more sort of blurred, but obviously it comes into account. But and then, yeah, it's engagement. If a video's got so many views on social media, then people are engaging with the content, and that's really important as well. So I think it's sort of not as clear cut as how many sales versus how much you spent. It's definitely around the sort of more general side.
I mean, you can also have a campaign that hasn't really got much done, but the book gets discovered at a particular time. So we've had books that sort of someone reads them on YouTube and it catches the imagination and the book sells huge amounts. But that wasn't our marketing or publicity, much as we like to be able to say, look how well this book has done. Or you can have a brilliant campaign and the engagement doesn't always work out with that converting to sales. So again, it is a bit nebulous. But yes, I would agree with Sarah that a lot of it is engagement and unfortunately a lot of it is sales. But I am a member, I'm the children's representative on the Publishers Publicity Circle committee, which is a sort of uniting of all the publicists in the book world. And we have an award every year, which I help judge the shortlist for the best publicity campaigns. And the sales are not always the biggest factor for us. A lot of that is like author care and what interesting things have you managed to do. So it's not always just about sales. It's, what kind of reaction you've managed to get to that book.
Yeah, the creativity as well, definitely, because that's sort of the fun bit.
And I guess kind of leading on from there, we've got a question for books coming out at the end of the year. This is obviously very specific, but I mean, any books really. Should writers leave the PR marketing to you, the experts in the publishing house, or should we as authors start publicising it ourselves? And in fact, do you need to work together, or can authors be loose cannons if they head off on their own marketing campaign?
That's such a lovely and polite question. I love being collaborative with an author. I really do. I really enjoy discussing. What I often do with my authors a few months before the book comes out is we have a phone call and we talk about all of the angles we could use and what they feel about events. And I really like that process. But you are not required to, but you should absolutely be talking about your book before it comes out. That you're excited about it, that it's 3 months to go, or you've planned your first author event. That's all lovely. The phrase "leave it all to the experts" is lovely. It is nice to reassure you that we are experts. We do know where to look for things. But if you have a book coming out and, there's sort of an aspect of your identity that means that there's a particular niche kind of press that you would like us to go for, I always like to hear, I'd really like you to put me forward for this. I like to collaborate. I like getting suggestions. I'm not so precious that I think I can't learn anything new. I will be learning about new outlets and options for the rest of my career. So I really like to hear from my author. It doesn't mean I can always make it happen. And if I say that it won't happen, it is nice when an author believes me. But no, I really thrive off a collaborative thing with my authors. It's why I do the job I do. I like doing publicity because I like being there with the author and making things happen.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree. I think it's different in different houses and it's different with different individuals, and I again do like working very collaboratively with authors, and also working at a small publisher I'm able to, because we don't have a huge volume of authors that it's difficult for me to keep in touch with them all. I do feel like I have great relationships with all of my authors, whereas if you're at a much bigger publishing house, that might not be as realistic. So I wouldn't like to speak on behalf of the whole industry, but I'd say just having that line of communication is really important. And even if you do end up doing a slightly separate, your own sort of activity, sort of talking to your publicist or marketer early on and say, I would love to do X, or I feel really like confident on Twitter and I'd love to sort of be tweeting pages of the books and when I'm doing the final proofreads and all of that. And I'm, fairly confident that your publicity person or marketing person would say, that sounds great, you go ahead and do that. But it's much better to have had that conversation than for your publicist or marketer to see stuff appearing on your social media without their any knowledge.
Oh, one big thing from me, sorry, that I've just remembered, is it is really not great for me when an author contacts a festival. It is great if you want to suggest them to us, particularly if it's a local festival. And you say, I've been going for years, I know the organizer, please could you get in touch with, or they've approached me. But particularly with sort of the bigger, what we call the national festivals, even though they're technically local, things like Bath and Edinburgh and Hay, we always have a meeting and we pitch, and it can become quite difficult if authors pitch themselves. I love to know what you want to be pitched for. That's great. There's no problem with you saying, I really want to do the Edinburgh Festival, can you pitch me? But I don't want you to pitch yourself to the Edinburgh Festival. Obviously this would be different for self-published authors. I don't know how that would work. But if you're published by a publishing house, just let your publicist know that you'd really like to go to a festival. They might not be able to make it happen, but it can make our relationships difficult with that festival. If they're like, oh, 5 of your authors have sent me an email, that's a bit trickier for me to handle. They like to have a chain of communication with us until the authors are established, and then there's often a bit more conversation.
So it's very much a question of keeping the dialogue open, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Communication between author and publicity.
Yeah, we're in communications. We like communicating.
And marketing. Yeah, it's your job. Yes. Okay. Brilliant. So how does school visits fit into that whole overall thing? Once the sort of book has been launched, do school visits then become very much the remit of the author to organise for themselves, or is the publishing house still involved in that aspect?
It's a mix of the two. So we, Sarah and I, both worked with an author called Emma Carroll, who you might know. She writes historical fiction and is a lovely person to follow on Twitter, actually. She's incredibly friendly and welcoming. And I worked on her first book, and that's, particularly for debuts, we tend to set up a good few events to get you going. But a lot of authors, like Emma, will then eventually run their own events as an extra part of their job. One thing to say is that a lot of the events I do tend to be publicity given and are not, they're at the time of the book coming out. So we're hoping that you'll do a few events for free to get the word out and sort of, I'd call it starting the ripples. If you sell sort of 5 books in a school and then they recommend it to people at guides and drama club and football. But then some authors, once they become more established, will start organising their own. There's a few organisations that can help authors that sort of take a cut of this fee. But yes, you can ask your publicist, and this one is Publicity, to help you set up school events. What I tend to prefer to do is I work with bookshops rather than direct with schools, because it all sounds very mercenary, but obviously the intention of my job is to sell books. And so if I have a bookshop signed up, which is another reason why it's a good idea to have a relationship with your local independent bookshop. They're, again, all very lovely. So I will speak to a bookshop, and then they will have a relationship with a lot of local schools, and we can then set up a tour, which obviously is very different now because digital events are becoming the norm, and I don't think we will ever go back solely to doing physical events. We will want to, because it's so lovely to have an author in your school, but also the situation we've had has meant we have been able to take authors places we wouldn't have been able to take them before, and that's really actually a big and exciting change. So I would say that we will also probably be organising digital events. But you can set up your own events, and a lot of authors will buy their own books at an author discount and sell them themselves and set up their own school events. It's just generally people need a little bit more confidence in doing the event before they do that. So both, really.
Brilliant. This is a really good, meaty industry type question. How much say do you have in acquisitions? So, that's stunned silence.
Shall I go?
Yeah, go for it. Well, the answers are different. So
yeah, again, it's very different with different publishers and different size publishers. So as I mentioned, we're a very small team, the children's team at Faber. So if an acquisition comes in, it gets sent to everybody who works on the children's books, myself included. So I will definitely have a read and have an opinion, but it is mainly led by the sales team and the editorial team in terms of what is acquired. But my input and the publicist's input is always valuable in terms of what market we think there is for the book. So we do have a say, but I mean, I don't decide how much we pay an author to buy their book. I don't decide sort of the number stuff. It's just sort of my opinions, which is nice.
I would, it's sort of similar in that the opinions of most departments are taken into account when making an acquisition, but it is at the end of the day an editorial decision and one led by sales and what they think they're going to be able to do. Occasionally, if a book has become very competitive and the publisher needs to do a pitch because there's several publishers involved, Publicity and marketing are more likely to get involved with here's what we could do for this book. But that by all means is not a regular thing, I would say. That is,
no, that's like once or twice.
Yeah, if that really, that's when you're having to try and beat out the other publishers with your elbows.
Brilliant. Okay, so what if a book sort of has a specific key audience? So the question specifically mentions the RSPB. So if you get a book that's a lot about birds, would you get in touch with somebody like the RSPB to sort of use their specialist line of contacts?
So this is the sort of the thing about planning for a campaign, and why I often love doing it with an author, is that so another author that I worked on at Faber just before I left was an author called Judith Eagle, and The Secret Starling, which had a cat in it called Stockwell, who was based on Judith's own cat, also called Stockwell, who was found at Stockwell Station. So as well as a lot of the sort of standard, children's media pitching and things like that, I pitched my cat magazine and other cat-related press, because those are the kind of people who love a story about finding a kitten in an underground station and bringing it home. So if it was a book that had a lot about birds, yes, I'd try, things like National Geographic Kids. And if the person who'd written the book, who had a big interest in birds, suggested that might be a good magazine to try for, then I absolutely would, yeah.
Yeah, we definitely do work with charity partners, but it tends to be quite tricky because they're often much bigger beasts with much more specific requirements, and often, rightly so, they need to get some profit from book sales, and margins on books are quite small. So it's not something we can do really regularly, but we did publish a picture book with the NSPCC where royalties went to the NSPCC. So it is done, but it's quite difficult, and I wouldn't say you can always do it. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but we'd always try it, and we'd always reach out, and we'd always try and work with the relevant organisations to reach that audience.
Brilliant. Right, and another one, which is quite a good question actually. What if you have politics on your social media and quite sort of specific views? Is that going to harm your author branding, author profile?
I cannot pretend it won't have an impact. That is not to say you shouldn't ever express a political opinion. Again, we talked about your profile being real. I have in the past occasionally had to speak to an author to say that, what this specific thing that you're talking about is very difficult and contentious, and could have an impact. I can never tell you not to. It's your Twitter. It's not, or Instagram. It's not something that's run by me. But I can advise you as a publicist as to whether that's a sensible thing to be talking about or not. I talk about politics on Twitter. I will say that there is a bias towards a particular leaning in the book world, and there are things that are therefore more controversial. There's a lot of preaching to the choir, I would say. So there's a lot of people with the same politics, and if you don't fit in with that, then it can be a little bit trickier sometimes in terms of reaction. Yes, having the wrong political opinion can hurt how people react to your books, but I also think not being true to yourself can come across as well. I would say not necessarily wading into large-scale debates that are particularly things that affect individual rights, which sometimes are not always a pleasant thing to debate because they're meant to be intrinsic. Sorry, this is getting very political now.
It's a difficult one, definitely.
It really is, because I don't like to limit what people say, but I can't pretend it won't have an effect.
I guess if as an author you have very strong socio-political views about something, and there's a chance it might spill over into the general ethos of your work, then you don't. If somebody is polar opposite in their opinions, then they're not going to be your
cup of tea anyway.
Yeah.
Yes. No. That is absolutely true. I think a lot of. Oh, sorry, go on, Sarah.
Well, if you're writing like a non-fiction kids book about politics, I can't quite visualize it, but if it's also relevant to what you're writing about, then absolutely you should discuss it, because we want, as a publisher, to see that you're informed and that you're engaged in these conversations. So I wouldn't shut it down immediately if you're worried, but just sort of being sensitive and care, and sort of saying things that you would say in real life, just being decent about it. I mean, It sounds really obvious, but just I don't think you should hide who you are or what your opinions are, but being a sensible, sensitive, decent person, regardless of your leanings, is the main thing.
And if your book contains things that aren't sensitive or are offensive to any members of the community, it's unlikely that it's going to get published anyway. So if those are your personal views, it's probably best to keep them to yourself.
It can be deeply unpleasant for you. I once joined in to defend a colleague online, and I had to lock my Twitter under the absolute deluge of nasty comments that I was getting. So I tend to avoid it a bit sometimes, and stick to happier topics.
Nice book things.
Yeah, exactly. Books are lovely. Why not just talk about those?
So I mean, I mentioned there and thought we haven't actually discussed that. The idea of author branding. What can you both say a little bit about that? About actually creating an author brand and what that means and what authors can do to sort of do that.
It's difficult. It's a difficult thing to do, and it's something that would not be done unless an author had a series of books, not necessarily in a series, but like a suitable enough backlist in order for a publisher that was successful enough for the publisher to be like, this is the next book by this person. And when that name starts carrying weight because of the presence in the industry or the success of the books, that is when that conversation would start happening. So it does take a long time, but it's something that your publisher would always be aware of and can start having those conversations about how to do that. But it sort of happens organically, I think, Hannah.
Yeah.
And then it's something that you sort of capitalize on. I will say that political chat can affect a brand. If your brand is, really lovely picture book author who does great live events and tends to, have a fondness for cats, and cats are your brand. If you're then talking about something completely different, very politically charged, that can have a bit of an impact on that soft kind of presentation that you've been giving before, I would say. And also, it's not always a bad thing to not have one. The author that I'm thinking of, and I'm probably going to mispronounce her surname, is Geraldine McCaughrean, who is a fabulous, fabulous author, who I wouldn't say has a particular brand because she does something completely new every time. Whereas someone who writes a lot of fantasy, that becomes a brand. And so it's not really necessary. It's something, it can be organic.
So there's several questions about, differentiating how much money gets spent on specific books, which is quite a complex thing, and I don't know if you can actually talk about that or whether that gets into
becomes
murky
a little bit
waters.
Too much about discussing our publishers.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a bit tricky, I'm afraid.
I just say, if your book doesn't have that much budget, that doesn't mean that the marketing publicist isn't going to work as hard. Just if they have less money, arguably you work harder on the books that you don't have any budget for because you've got to get a campaign out there without being able to just send off some money and get something in return on the marketing side, at least. So, it's working with partnerships and organizations and running competitions and doing activity that is seemingly organic is arguably more work than just putting a £500 budget on a Facebook advert. So I don't think authors obviously it's easy for me to say, but I don't think that authors need to fixate on how much money is being put, because the campaign can still be really strong and the marketer or publicist will still work really hard, regardless of how much budget they're given by their publisher.
Okay, that's a good
because we wouldn't buy a book if we didn't want it to sell copies. We always want a book to do well. Otherwise we wouldn't acquire it. It would be a waste of everyone's time and money. So
Okay, last two questions because we're running out of time, and they're quite nice. They quite nicely go together. What are the key skills for that you think you need for each of your jobs, and what is the most fun, exciting, bizarre, weird thing you've done as a campaign, apart from obviously reading to goats, which is just brilliant. So, do you want to start, Hannah, and then we'll finish with Sarah?
From being a publicist, one of the most important things is being incredibly organised. which is laughable because in my personal life I'm really not. All of my organisation goes into my job. But that's simplest things as putting a tour together, what train we're getting where, have we got a hotel there for the author to stay in. But also it's things like if I'm pitching, journalists are obviously absolutely swamped in pitches. So sometimes I'll email again if I haven't had a reply. But I don't want to email them again and chase them if I only emailed them the day before and I've forgotten about it. So I have a spreadsheet for every book of everyone I've spoken to, when I spoke to them, what kind of response I got, if they were out of office, so it's actually okay to do it a couple of days later, and things like that. And I really have to keep on top of it. I'm organising the event itself, helping an author know that, at this point you should maybe do a reading, and at this point you need to switch. Often managing questions. I have to wrangle children in signing queues, which means I'm terribly messy and disorganized in my daily life, but I cultivate it for my job. I'm going to let Sarah do her skills while I try and think of the most bizarre thing I've done, because goats has been taken.
Skills wise, I'd say for marketing is definitely being creative, being able to sort of think to create lovely assets or different POS, sort of differentiating your campaign so that they're not all the same, you're not doing the same things for the different books, and also sort of just being able to be strategic and sort of logical, and being able to again sort of organize your budget and make sure you're prioritizing and using your time and money most effectively. Have you thought of something? I think one of my highlights was running around Somerset with Emma Carroll. She wrote a book called The Somerset Tsunami, and I'd spent quite a lot of money already and I didn't have a huge budget left, but I really wanted to take it to the locations mentioned in the book. So my dad's friend had some filming experience from working in television. So I got him to drive me and Emma around Somerset and video her sort of walking along the beach, and it was pouring with rain, but she brought her lovely little dog called Olive. And it was a chaotic day of driving around in the rain and sort of trying to film her on Glastonbury tour, talking about the book with the wind and her hair, and it was completely manic. But and then I spent probably 2 weeks trying to edit all the footage because we had so many different takes. But then it sort of came together and was this really lovely piece of content, which ended up being shared quite widely on social media. So it was all worth it, but it was a very fun, like the more chaotic, the more fun, silly days that I have. That's what I miss most about what we're doing at the moment, really.
Yeah. I think the reason I'm struggling is because there's so many. I've been up trying to write up an author's comment and the entire whiteboard's collapsed on me, and I've got small children trying to make me feel better about it. I think the most recent one is I work on the Tom Gates books by Liz Pichon, and we did a cover reveal by getting a black and white printout of the cover, finding a school local to Liz, and getting an entire class of children to colour it in while we filmed it from above, and we then did it as a time lapse for all of these colours appearing, which meant I was working with an entire class of children, which I have so much respect for teachers. And I bought these really fancy pens called Posca pens, which are beautiful but stain everything. And there's all these children leaning across it with their jumpers, and I'm thinking there's going to be so many parents wanting to murder me. So luckily there was no sound, because most of the sound in the background would be like, roll up your sleeves. But it made this beautiful, beautiful cover reveal in about sort of 30 seconds of watching, as it all just comes to life with all these kids. They had such a great time, and Liz went in afterwards and met all the kids and thanked them for bringing her cover to life. I think we gave them the cover as well in the end, so that they could keep for their school. And that was just such a lovely and fun day, and seeing kids get inspired is the best part of my job, which is again why I miss doing events.
We don't get this in adult publishing. That's why it's very easy to convince people to do children's, because we do such silly things.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's been absolutely amazing. One question that has been asked a couple of times, I said you can come back to the chat. So audience, the link that you used to access this now, you can access it again anytime, because it has been recorded. The recording will be available within minutes of us finishing, and all the chat will be there down the side. It doesn't appear in real time as you have, so you don't have to watch it again to see it happen. The chat as it exists in its entirety will be there. If you click on that link, you can scroll up and down and read any of it at any time. Just to point you also at the donate to 7 stories button at the bottom. We have made this all free, but if you've enjoyed this session and you can donate to 7 27 stories, that would be great. They are our National Centre for Children's Books. They have an amazing archive of notebooks and first drafts and information from authors dating way back. It's a most incredible resource, and they do a lot of work with children's literacy and promoting books and authors around the country, and especially in the northeast. So yes, thank you very much to Hanna Lough, publicist from Scholastic, and Sarah Lough, marketing manager from Faber. That's whoops-a-daisy, who hasn't got their notes in front of them. Yeah.
Thanks so much for having us, and thank you
Hanna
for your lovely questions.
You're publicity manager as well, aren't you, Hanna, for Scholastic?
Senior publicity
manager.
It'll do.
There you go. So we've got the big wigs in today. We've had it from the top of the tree, and that has been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for being
such
a lovely, enthusiastic viewing audience as well. It's really nice to get
do
to
follow us
chat
on
about our
Twitter.
job.
We'll always say hello.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Bye.